All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling, well, more like carefully dissecting, a paper that really gets at the heart of how we're talking about, or maybe not talking about, this whole generative AI thing in the design world. It's only been, 3 years since Stable Diffusion kind of blew the doors open, and it's already changed so much about how we think about what design even is, how we do it, how we judge it.
Yeah, it's been wild. Like the pace of change has been just incredible. But it's like anytime we have these big tech shakeups, our conversations, they tend to cling to these super simple ideas, almost like, I don't know, roadblocks in our thinking. And this paper, they call them semantic stopsigns. And they can really get in the way of like having meaningful research and making actual progress, in design.
Right, exactly. So our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to really unpack 5 of these really common semantic stop signs that just keep popping up around GenAI in design. And we've got some great research to draw on here, looking at expert workshops and some pretty in-depth interviews with design professionals who are, right there in the trenches using this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not just going to be a theoretical thing, right? We want to connect these big picture discussions to like the nitty-gritty of actually doing design work. Give you, the listener, a way to really question some of those assumptions you might be running into about GenAI, in your own world.
And what I think is really cool about this paper is that it doesn't just point out these oversimplifications. It's like, okay, here's how we can reframe those, into something more useful, more nuanced. Gives you a, I don't know, more practical way of thinking about it. And that's key for working with GenAI, actually using it, not just talking about it.
So, all right, first up, AI is unreliable. I mean, that one probably hits home for a lot of folks, right? I mean, we've all seen those social media posts, those AI fails, like the architectural plans with those crazy features that like defy physics, or UIs that are missing stuff, or, got things duplicated. And then there's those creepy pictures of extra fingers, like, oh, AI, you so silly.
Yeah, well, this paper, they actually use a really specific scenario to illustrate this, which I thought was helpful. So picture this.
Yeah.
You've got this architecture firm, and they're messing around with AI, trying to generate some concepts for like really complex stuff, building facades, really intricate stairwells. And what they get back are these like super visually striking avant-garde designs, but like totally unbuildable, curved landings that just like wouldn't work structurally, balustrades just kind of hanging in midair, no floor underneath. And so, of course, the senior architects immediately go, nope, AI is unreliable. We're done here.
And I can totally see how that becomes the easy way out, right? You slap that label on it, unreliable, and it's tempting to just like throw the whole technology out the window, especially in a field like architecture where, safety is a huge deal. Like one little mistake and boom, disaster. So yeah, there's a real fear there among design professionals about, messing up quality, compromising safety. Nobody wants that.
But here's the thing, right? This is where the nuance comes in. Yeah, those reliability issues, they're real.
Yeah.
AI can totally hallucinate, right? Like it can just make stuff up, and it can pick up biases from the data it was trained on. And sometimes, yeah, it just spits out stuff that's just plain non-functional. But, and this is a big but, the authors argue that with the right, understanding, and this is key, human oversight, this unreliable AI can actually be super valuable. You got to think of it less like a magic design machine and more like a really creative, if kind of clumsy brainstorming buddy.
So it's about using it as a starting point, right? Not the final product. Generate a ton of ideas, see what sticks, and then you, the human designer, you step in and you refine, you filter, you make sure it actually works in the real world.
Exactly. It's about critical optimism, they call it. Basically, acknowledge the downsides, the real risks, but also see the potential. Because AI, it can do some pretty amazing things. Generate ideas at a speed we could never match, spot patterns we might miss, and it's got that raw computational power. But to use that responsibly, ethically, we got to set up some guardrails, right? We need ethical guidelines, we need user testing, we got to get way better at writing prompts and figure out how to really validate those outputs, make sure they're legit.
It makes me think of when CAD and all those other digital tools first came into architecture. I bet there was a lot of pushback at first, right? Probably some architects who were like, nope, give me my drafting table and my T-square. And I'm sure there were some pretty epic digital design fails early on, things that just wouldn't translate to the real world. But architects adapted, right? They learned new ways of working, new tools. It's almost like they became master builders in this new digital space. So it sounds like this unreliability isn't the end of the story for GenAI. It's a challenge. It's pushing us to evolve how we design, learn new skills.
Exactly. Which brings us nicely to our next semantic stock sign, and this one's a doozy. All GenAI infringes IP. Now, this is a hot button issue, especially for creative industries, where intellectual property is everything.
Oh, totally. I mean, imagine this. You've got a design team, bunch of different disciplines, and they're kicking around the idea of using Gen AI for, I don't know, different things, right? Maybe using large language models to do research, image diffusion to visualize like UIs or physical products, maybe even using AI to analyze UX research data. And then someone pipes up and says, hold on, any use of Gen AI is plagiarism, full stop. And suddenly, the whole conversation just grinds to a halt.
Right, because the heart of this concern is the training data, right? These AI models, they learn from these massive data sets. And a lot of times, the people who created that content, they didn't exactly give permission for it to be used this way. So if an artist posts their work online and it ends up being part of a model's training data, there's this fear that parts of their style, even specific details, could show up in the AI's output. And that raises some totally valid concerns about, are we undermining creative professions? And it throws a wrench into existing IP law, which, as the paper points out, was written way before this kind of technology even existed.
Yeah, it brings up all these tricky questions about, like, where does inspiration end and copying begin? Where's the line? There's definitely arguments to be made for fair use, especially if the AI's output is significantly different, transformative. But then there's the counter argument that these AI creations, they can sometimes have the same commercial impact as a direct copy. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, who's the author? Who owns the rights? It's a tension that's been playing out online for years, right? From remix culture to like all those legal battles over, who owns what online. It's a messy world.
Totally. And the nuanced perspective here, it recognizes that this debate isn't going away anytime soon. It's not a simple yes or no. So the paper suggests some practical things we can do, like we need to get much better at attributing AI usage, being transparent about how it's being used in design, and maybe even like proactively engaging with the original creators whose work is in the training data. They also point to models like the Free Software Foundation, which is pushing for IP frameworks to evolve, to better balance the rights of creators with the bigger goals of like innovation, collaboration, and making knowledge accessible to more people.
Right. So it's not about hitting a wall with the IP question. It's about finding ways to like work with AI responsibly, respecting creative rights, and maybe even using this as a chance to rethink how intellectual property works in this new crazy digital world. So let's move on. Stop sign number 3. AI is just a tool. Now, this one sounds pretty straightforward, right? But the paper argues it's actually way more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's kind of deceptive, this one, because you hear it used in a couple of different ways. Like for people who are all in on AI, they use it to reassure folks who are, freaking out about AI replacing humans, right? It's like, hey, chill, it's just another tool. Like we upgraded our software, that's all. But then you've got the skeptics who use that same phrase to dismiss AI as like all hype, like, oh, it's a fad, it'll never replace real human design thinking.
And the paper, they give us these 2 really great examples, which I thought were super helpful. So first you got this design studio and they're like super excited about Gen AI, and the director's all, yeah, it's just another tool, no biggie. But then over time, their work starts to like lose its unique flavor. It gets kind of generic, starts looking like, all this stuff that comes out of Midjourney. And then on the flip side, you've got this like strategic consultancy, and they're totally dismissive of AI, like just hype, ignore it. But then they start struggling to keep up. Clients are asking for AI-driven research analysis, and they're falling behind competitors who are using these new tools.
And what's really interesting here is how this seemingly innocent phrase, just a tool, it actually hides the very real way that AI is shaping the outcomes we see. The authors, they talk about Bruno Latour's work and his idea of actancy. Basically, it's this idea that technologies aren't passive. They have their own like inherent properties, limitations that influence the results we get, when we use them.
Right, because unlike a traditional tool where the designer provides the core material, the brushstrokes in Photoshop, the shapes in CAD Gen AI, it actually generates stuff wholesale.
Yeah.
Based on that massive data set it was trained on. So it's not just influencing how designers work, it's influencing what they're working with. It's baking in all those underlying assumptions, those biases that were present in the data it learned from.
Exactly. Like a designer using a pen tool, they have total control over every curve, every point. But someone using a text-to-image AI, they're being steered, by the AI's aesthetic biases, the possibilities it's learned. It's like it nudges you towards certain styles, certain tropes. And for the skeptics, the ones who are like, oh, AI is just hype, they're missing the point. AI can do things we can't. It can boost our creativity, it can automate those tedious tasks, and it can make sense of these huge, messy data sets. Ignoring that, well, it can leave design teams behind in a world that's changing fast.
So to get past this just a tool idea, we got to recognize that AI is a player in the game, right? It's not just sitting there passively. It's actively reshaping how we design. In the paper, they suggest some things we can do, like auditing these tools to see if they're favoring certain aesthetics, maybe fine-tuning AI models on custom data sets, data that reflects a studio's values, their style, and maybe even like using this tendency towards homogenization, that AI have to actually break through creative block or get past design fixation. It's about seeing AI as a collaborator, a partner in the design process, something that can both reflect and refine a team's creative identity. It's a back and forth.
Okay, on to semantic stop sign number 4. AI is bad for the environment. And this one, it taps into some very real concerns about sustainability, which is something we can't ignore.
Totally. And the paper, they lay out these two contrasting scenarios, which I thought was really effective. So on the one hand, you've got this research group, and they're using a lot of computing power to develop AI for like monitoring endangered species. And they're arguing, hey, the environmental cost is worth it because we might be able to save these species from extinction. And then on the other hand, you've got this design conference workshop, and they're all about sustainable design. And they're like, nope, no GenAI allowed. It's fundamentally unsustainable.
And these examples, they show how environmental concerns can become a stop sign, a conversation killer going both ways, right?
Yeah.
It's like this paradox that prevents us from having a more nuanced discussion about, like, okay, when and how can Gen AI be used responsibly? And yes, the worries about data centers sucking up energy, the impact of manufacturing all that hardware, they're valid. We can't just brush those aside.
But the paper, they make this really important point about the complexity of this issue. Like, yeah, AI can use a lot of energy in the short term, but it also has the potential to make things more sustainable in the long run. Optimizing supply chains and monitoring environmental changes more effectively. And that example of using AI for conservation, that's a perfect illustration of this paradox. Like, you're using a lot of computing power to potentially save the environment. It's tricky.
Right. And instead of letting that shut down the conversation, the authors argue that it should actually make us dig deeper. Like, we got to move past these generalizations and look at specific contexts, look at the environmental impact at different scales. It's about acknowledging the potential benefits and the limitations. It's about going beyond just the carbon footprint and thinking about AI's role in these larger systems, ecological well-being. It's bigger than just like, how much energy is it using?
It's about asking the hard questions, right? Like, when does the potential benefit of using AI outweigh the environmental cost? It's got to be case-by-case thing, not a blanket ban based on some general idea that all AI is bad for the planet. So we've reached our final semantic stop sign. AI is a race to the bottom. And this one, it really gets at those fears about are we going to lose jobs or human skills going to become worthless?
Yeah, it's a common narrative, right? And we've seen it play out in some pretty high profile ways, like recently with those Hollywood strikes. AI was a huge part of that dispute. And the paper, they use the example of Lionsgate partnering with this AI startup to, potentially cut costs in filmmaking. And it's like that kind of move, it creates this pressure, right? Other studios are like, oh, we got to use AI too, or we'll be left behind. And that can lead to rushing to implement AI without thinking about the consequences. Maybe sacrificing quality, cutting corners, putting people's jobs at risk.
And it echoes those criticisms we've heard about technology in other industries too, right? Like this constant push for efficiency, cutting costs. And then it's like, okay, but what about the quality of the work? What about the people who are losing their jobs? And the rise of all these AI products from like all the big tech companies, it just adds fuel to the fire, right? People are worried about mass unemployment, the risks of unchecked automation, and a few big corporations having all the power.
Right, but the authors, they make this really important distinction. They argue that it's not the technology itself that inevitably leads to this race to the bottom. It's about how it's managed, the economic incentives. Like the Hollywood strikes, they showed that collective action, unions, they can actually fight back, negotiate agreements that protect workers and set standards for how AI is used. And in nonprofit settings, community projects, Gen AI can actually make things more accessible, empower people who wouldn't normally have access to these tools. And then there's open source AI, which is often more focused on responsible development, transparency, rather than just, making money as fast as possible.
So yeah, the fear of a race to the bottom is real. It's based on real concerns. But it doesn't mean we should just give up. We got to look at how these competitive pressures can be managed, how we can use things like collective bargaining to steer AI in a more positive direction. It's not just about the tech, it's about the people, the policies, the power structures. It's complicated.
Totally. So, across all 5 of these semantic stop signs, the common thread seems to be this. We got to move past these knee-jerk reactions, these oversimplified narratives, and really engage with the complexity of GenAI in design.
Exactly. And the authors, they talk about this collective journey we need to take. Like, you gotta move beyond just the surface level anxieties and get to a place of like real understanding, concrete action. Because these stop signs, they might come from a good place, genuine concerns, but they can also block us from exploring new possibilities, developing ways to use these powerful technologies responsibly. And the big takeaway, I think, is that we shouldn't treat these concerns as like conversation enders, right?
Yeah.
They're starting points. They're opportunities to learn both individually and as a community. We got to encourage people who are critical of AI to like really engage with it, not just dismiss it out of hand. And for those who are super excited about AI, it's like, okay, take a breath, think critically, and proceed with caution. Don't just rush in blindly.
Right. And the paper, they offer some concrete ways to do that, like embracing productive tension. Basically, bring everyone to the table, even people who are like super skeptical of AI, because getting those different perspectives, those dissenting voices, that can actually lead to better, more ethical design decisions.
And another strategy is like flipping the script on the challenges. Don't see them as roadblocks, see them as design opportunities. Like, take those tension points, efficiency versus environmental impact, human control versus AI assistance, and treat them as design constraints. Use those limitations to drive creative problem solving. And even those AI hallucinations, those weird, unexpected outputs, they can actually spark some really interesting ideas if you approach them with the right mindset.
Yeah, totally. And documenting everything is key. Sharing what works, what doesn't, both the successes and the failures. That way we can all learn from each other and the whole field can get better, develop more robust methods. And the authors also talk about developing reflective stances on GenAI. It's basically taking the time to think deeply about the ethical implications, the practical considerations, the societal impact of this technology. And that can help designers develop like a clear, informed perspective that guides their work.
It all comes back to the idea that design researchers, we have a responsibility to engage with these messy questions, these conflicting values, because that's how we're going to figure out how to use GenAI in a way that's responsible, ethical, and just.
Right. And the authors, they admit that this research is just a starting point. They worked with a specific group of people. The stop signs they identified, those aren't the only ones out there. And AI is evolving so fast, what's true today might not be true tomorrow.
And they suggest some really interesting avenues for future research, like doing longitudinal studies to see how using GenAI over time actually changes design practices, developing better ways to measure the costs and benefits, especially when it comes to sustainability, and building like infrastructure for shared learning, maybe case study repositories, communities of practice where designers can exchange ideas and experiences.
At the end of the day, this paper is a call to action for design researchers. It's like, hey, we got to grapple with these tensions, these different perspectives, if we want to shape AI in a way that's positive and beneficial for everyone.
So we've spent this deep dive exploring these 5 semantic stop signs that can really get in the way of having productive, nuanced conversations about generative AI in design research. And by offering a critical perspective, some concrete strategies for moving past these simplistic narratives, the authors give us a framework for critical optimism. Acknowledging the challenges, but actively working towards a future where AI is used responsibly and ethically in design.
And hopefully you, the listener, are walking away from this with some tools to identify and challenge those kinds of oversimplifications in your own work, your own field, because that's how we're going to move beyond the hype, beyond the fear, and actually figure out how to use this technology in a way that benefits everyone.
Absolutely. Open conversation, a willingness to experiment, and sharing what we learn, those are going to be key as this whole AI thing keeps evolving.
Okay, so for our novel notions segment, let's get a little wild. What if we actually embraced the unreliability of current GenAI models? Like, not as a bug, but as a feature. What if we trained these models on like incomplete data, contradictory data, even stuff that just doesn't make sense? Could we create entirely new forms of art, new design solutions by breaking free from the predictable patterns, the biases that are baked into most training data?
Whoa, that's an interesting twist. It's like, instead of trying to make AI perfectly reliable, we're saying, hey, let's see what happens when we let it go off the rails a bit. It's almost like those adversarial attacks in AI research where they introduce noise to expose vulnerabilities and make the system more robust. But in this case, the vulnerability becomes the source of creativity.
Right. And what if we connected that to the whole IP debate? Like, what if we trained models on all sorts of copyrighted material, but with the goal of creating things that are clearly transformative, and we make sure to give proper attribution? Could that help us redefine fair use in this age of AI? Maybe even lead to new legal frameworks that are better suited to how creativity works with these new tools. It's risky, for sure, but it could be groundbreaking. It forces us to confront the limits of both the technology and our legal systems. And I mean, this is all speculation, just food for thought, but it shows how questioning those basic assumptions about GenAI can open up all these crazy possibilities. We could discover whole new ways to create, to innovate ethically. We could push past the limits of what we think we know and do things we never thought possible.
Mind blown. Lots to ponder there. And as always, you can find a link to the full paper in the description below if you want to dive deeper into all this. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.